Hi guys, tonight we are standing with you at the edge of a mountain camp as the sun slips away faster than you expect. The light thins, the air sharpens, and the ground beneath your boots already feels colder than it did an hour ago. Canvas tents sag slightly in the evening chill. Thin smoke hangs low, smelling of damp wood and metal tools that have stopped ringing for the day. You pull your coat closer without really meaning to, because instinct arrives before thought up here. This is the moment when you realize something uncomfortable. You probably won't survive this if you arrived unprepared, and many people did exactly that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and stay with me as you step fully into the first night of a gold rush mining camp high in the mountains, where warmth becomes a shared obsession and darkness feels closer than it ever did back home. You arrive late in this day because that's how journeys worked. Trails were slow, wagons broke, animals tired. By the time you crest the final rise and see the camp scattered below, the temperature has already begun its nightly drop. During the day, the sun tricked you. It reflected off pale soil and rock and made you believe the climate was harsh but manageable. At night, the mountains correct that misunderstanding. Cold sinks into low places. Wind slides downhill like water. Even in summer, frost can appear without asking permission. One widely recognized fact among historians is that many gold rush camps were located at elevations where nighttime temperatures routinely fell below freezing, even when daytime conditions felt mild. People who had spent their lives near coasts or in cities simply had no reference point for this kind of daily swing. You feel it now, as your fingers stiffen while tying a rope or fumbling with a buckle. The cold is not dramatic yet. It is quiet, patient, and methodical. Around you, others are going through the same realization. Some move faster, driven by a small, rising panic. Some slow down, conserving energy. A few just stand still and stare, as if the camp itself might offer answers. Tents form uneven rows. A few rough timber cabins lean slightly, their walls still pale and raw. This is not a town, it is a temporary idea, made physical, and at night its weaknesses show. You choose a place to sleep. Maybe it is a canvas tent shared with two strangers. Maybe it is a corner of a half-built cabin where the roof still leaks starlight. The ground is hard. Even before you lie down, it radiates cold upward, reminding you that warmth does not naturally belong here. People learned quickly that the earth itself could steal heat faster than the air ever could. A lesser known but fascinating detail from personal diaries is that some miners initially slept directly on bare ground, their first nights assuming fatigue would overcome discomfort. Many woke shivering uncontrollably long before morning. This mistake rarely happened twice. Memory becomes sharp when cold teaches it. As darkness settles, sound changes. During the day, camps are noisy with metal striking, stone voices calling out measurements, arguments, laughter. At night, noise compresses. You hear coughing from nearby tents. Wood cracks softly as it contracts. Somewhere, a mule shifts its weight and exhales. Wind threads through gaps in canvas with a whisper that never quite repeats itself. You notice how everyone gravitates toward fire. Small fires, big fires, carefully banked, coals glowing like eyes in the dirt. Fire is not just comfort here, it is strategy. It is survival, math done instinctively. How much fuel do you have? How long will it last? Who stays closest? Who sleeps farther back? These questions shape the night more than any map. Historians still argue whether early mining camps underestimated cold because of optimism or because of sheer ignorance, and the truth probably sits somewhere in between. Many believed discomfort was temporary, a small price for future wealth. Cold had other plans. It did not care about future promises. You sit or crouch near a fire and feel the strange unevenness of warmth. Your face heats while your back cools rapidly. Turn too much one way and you lose the benefit. Turn too much the other and sparks threaten your clothing. There is no perfect position, only compromise. You begin to understand that survival here is not about eliminating discomfort, but managing it continuously. A quirky tidbit that often surprises people is that some miners kept small stones near fires, heating them, and then wrapping them in cloth to place near their feet at night. It was an improvised version of a bed warmer, born not from luxury, but desperation. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it cooled too quickly, but trying something felt better than doing nothing. As the hours pass, fatigue finally pulls at you. You lie down fully dressed. Removing clothes feels dangerous rather than relaxing. Your breath fogs briefly inside the tent or shelter before drifting away. The ground presses back against your body. You tuck your knees slightly, not for comfort, but to reduce exposed surface area. You do not think of it in scientific terms. Your body already knows. This first night teaches you something fundamental. Cold is not an event. It is a condition. It does not arrive all at once. It seeps. It accumulates. It waits for you to stop paying attention. That realization changes behavior quickly. People who survived learn to think ahead, even while exhausted. Outside, stars burn with unsettling clarity. At altitude, the sky feels closer, heavier somehow. There is beauty here, but it does not soften the cold. If anything, it sharpens it by contrast. You feel very small beneath it all, a single warm shape, trying to stay warm among indifferent stone and air. By the time sleep finally comes, it is light and fragmented. You drift, then surface again. A gust rattles canvas. Someone shifts nearby. A fire pops. You are not fully resting, but you are enduring. And for now, that is enough. This is how it begins. Not with gold itself, but with the night teaching you its rules. You wake before you mean to, not because morning has arrived, but because the cold has found a gap you did not know existed. Your body registers it before your mind catches up. Fingers stiff, toes numb enough that they feel distant, like they belong to someone else. The fire has shrunk to a faint glow, no longer a presence, just a suggestion. This is the second lesson of the mountain camp. Night does not stay still. It changes shape while you sleep. You shift slightly, and the movement costs more energy than expected. Muscles resist, breath feels sharper in your chest. Around you, others stir in similar half-conscious ways. Someone coughs deep and wet. Someone else mutters not words, just sound. Nobody fully wakes yet. Waking means facing the cold head-on, and instinct delays that confrontation as long as possible. A well-established historical reality is that many miners underestimated how long cold nights lasted in high-altitude camps. They expected a dip in temperature after sunset and a gradual recovery toward dawn. What they experienced instead was a prolonged low-point hours where the cold settled and refused to lift. This pattern caught newcomers off guard and reshaped how nights were endured. You become aware of the wind. It has shifted direction since you fell asleep. Canvas that once blocked it now funnels it. A gap near the ground sends a steady stream of icy air across your ankles. Someone nearby stuffs clothing or spare sacks into cracks, working by feel rather than sight. The darkness makes everything slower, more deliberate. The first night shock is not dramatic. There is no sudden blizzard, no cinematic collapse. It is quieter than that. It is the realization that your body is losing heat faster than it can produce it while resting. That realization carries a low hum of anxiety. You try to breathe more slowly, telling yourself that tension only wastes warmth. Some miners learn this lesson through repeated micro-awakenings, never sleeping deeply enough to truly recover. Personal letters mention nights described as long watches rather than rest. Sleep became something you circled without fully entering, especially during the first weeks. Fatigue stacked up, dulling judgment during the day. An odd but true detail that appears in a handful of camp accounts is that some men slept sitting upright against rocks or crates on their earliest nights, believing that lying flat increased contact with cold ground. It was not especially comfortable, but it felt marginally warmer to some. Whether it actually helped remains questionable, but belief alone offered a sense of control. You pull your hat lower over your ears. The fabric smells faintly of sweat and smoke. Not pleasant, but familiar. Familiarity matters here. Anything that reminds you of your own body heat feels reassuring. You draw your arms inward, tucking hands under your armpits, a reflex as old as humanity itself. Historians still debate whether miners adapted faster psychologically or physically to cold conditions. Some argue the body adjusted first, improving circulation and tolerance. Others suggest mental acceptance came sooner, allowing people to stop fighting discomfort and instead manage it. Standing here in the dark, half awake, the difference feels academic. Both adjustments are happening together slowly. You notice how sound travels at night. Every small movement seems louder. A boot scraping wood sounds like a deliberate action rather than an accident. The quiet magnifies everything. That makes you more careful, conserving motion, conserving heat. Even breathing feels like something to be managed. Somewhere nearby, someone gets up fully. You hear footsteps crunch softly on frost forming over dirt. A fire is coaxed back to life. Sparks lift briefly into the air and vanish. That person becomes momentarily important to everyone around, even if no one speaks. Heat shared is heat saved. A lesser discussed but important fact is that early camps rarely had enough fuel to keep fires burning strongly all night. Wood had to be gathered during daylight hours, often hauled long distances. Burning too much at night meant going without later. This forced a constant balancing act, comfort now versus survival later. You feel the temptation to move closer to the fire, but space is limited. Social rules form quickly around warmth. Who arrived first? Who contributed fuel? Who looks most desperate? These unspoken negotiations happen silently, shaped by glances and proximity. Cold creates hierarchy without needing words. A quirky fringe detail from one miner journal mentions men sleeping in shifts near fires rotating positions, so no one froze while the coals were hottest. It reads almost like a watch schedule at sea, except the enemy was temperature rather than tide. Not every camp did this, but the idea appeared more than once. As the night deepens, the cold becomes steadier, almost predictable. You stop flinching at it. This is another adaptation. The shock dulls. What remains is a constant pressure, like a weight you carry rather than a pain you fight. Your body settles into a tense truce with the environment. You doze again briefly. Dreams are thin and fragmented. Images flicker without depth. A warm room from memory, a voice from home, then nothing. Then the sensation of cold pulling you back toward awareness. Sleep here is not an escape, it is a pause. By the time the sky begins to lighten, almost imperceptibly, you feel more worn than rested. Yet you are still here, still breathing, still capable of standing when morning demands it. That counts as success in these camps. This second lesson lingers with you long after sunrise. Cold is not just something that happens at night. It shapes behavior before sunset and after dawn. It teaches planning, it teaches humility, and it ensures that no one ever forgets their first true mountain night. By the third evening, you no longer pretend that shelter is optional. The daylight hours taught you that gold might glitter, but warmth decides whether you can keep searching for it. As the sun lowers again, you pay closer attention to the shapes around you. Tents, lean-tos, rough cabins with gaps you can see daylight through. They no longer look temporary, they look like lifelines. You choose canvas or timber, not based on comfort but on availability. Canvas goes up fast. A few poles, some rope, a practice knot or two. It flaps in the wind and breathes too easily, but it keeps frost from settling directly on your skin. Timber takes longer. Cutting, hauling, fitting pieces together with imperfect tools, but once it stands even poorly, it holds something precious inside, still air. Still. A broadly accepted historical observation is that miners quickly shifted from sleeping entirely outdoors to constructing some form of enclosure even when resources were scarce. Letters from the period show a clear pattern. The first nights are endured, the following days are spent building. Shelter becomes priority, equal to food. You step inside a tent and notice the smell immediately. damp canvas, smoke embedded in fabric, a faint sourness from unwashed clothes. None of it bothers you as much as it might have back home. These smells mean survival. They mean warmth has existed here recently. Timber shelters tell a different story. Fresh cut pine or fir releases a sharp, clean scent that mixes with smoke and earth. The walls creak as temperature drops, boards shrinking and pulling against nails that never quite fit right. You run a hand along a plank and feel how cold it already is. Wood does not generate warmth, but it slows its escape. You notice the floor, or rather, the lack of one. Bare ground inside a shelter feels slightly less hostile than open ground, but it still steals heat relentlessly. Some miners scatter pine boughs, straw, or even spare clothing beneath where they plan to sleep. The goal is not softness. It is separation. Every layer between your body and the earth buys you time. An interesting fringe detail appears in a few camp records, describing miners hanging blankets or spare canvas inside shelters to create inner walls. This early form of insulation trapped pockets of air and reduced drafts. It was not elegant, but it worked just enough to be repeated. You learn to position yourself carefully, not directly against walls where cold radiates inward, not beneath obvious gaps where wind sneaks through. You memorize where the shelter leaks and where it holds. This knowledge becomes as familiar as knowing which pocket holds your knife. Historians still disagree about whether these early shelters were primarily meant for warmth or for psychological comfort. Some argue that feeling enclosed mattered as much as actual temperature control. Others point to measurable differences in heat retention. Standing here, listening to wind brush past rather than through you, it feels like both answers are true. The night arrives faster now that you expect it. You light a small fire outside or near the entrance, careful not to ignite canvas or dry wood. Fire inside shelters is dangerous but tempting. Many learn this lesson the hard way. Smoke fills enclosed spaces quickly. Sparks travel unpredictably. Still, in especially cold conditions, some risk it anyway. A mainstream fact often overlooked is that fires were frequently built just outside shelter entrances, allowing heat to radiate inward while smoke escaped upward. This created a narrow zone of warmth that everyone competed for. The placement of a shelter relative to fire mattered enormously. You sit inside watching shadows ripple across fabric or planks. The firelight makes everything feel temporary and alive. The shelter breathes as the wind shifts. You adjust your position again, slower now, conserving energy. Sleep comes a little easier than the first nights. Not because it is warmer, but because you have expectations now. You know the cold will arrive. You know where it will creep in. There are fewer surprises. That alone eases tension. A quirky note from a miner diary mentions someone stuffing empty flour sacks with dry grass to create makeshift pillows that also acted as insulation. The writer admitted they smelled terrible, but kept his head from touching frozen ground. Necessity lowers standards quickly. You lie down fully dressed boots nearby, but not on. Removing boots lets feet relax and improves circulation, but only if they can be dried enough to avoid dampness. Damp boots become weapons against warmth. You check them by touch, deciding whether to keep them on or off. There is no perfect choice. Outside, wind strengthens briefly, testing every knot and seam. The shelter holds, not perfectly, but well enough. You feel a small, quiet relief. Shelter does not eliminate cold. It changes its character. It makes it manageable. As the night deepens, you hear the camp settle. Fires dim, voices fade. The occasional crack of wood contracting echoes through the darkness. You focus on your breathing, slow and deliberate. Each exhale fogs briefly in the air before disappearing. This is when you realize something subtle. Shelter is not just about surviving one night. It allows the body to recover just enough to function tomorrow. It turns exhaustion into something temporary rather than cumulative. By morning, frost coats the outside of canvas and clings to wooden walls like pale lace. Inside, it is marginally warmer, enough that your fingers still move, enough that you can stand without shaking, enough to continue. You step out into the thin morning light with a new respect for these fragile structures. They are not homes. They are agreements between human bodies and an indifferent environment. And tonight you will depend on them again. As the fourth night settles in, you understand something quietly but completely. Fire is no longer just warmth. It is timing, discipline, and restraint. You approach it differently now, with less urgency and more respect. The flames do not roar the way you might want them to. They are kept low controlled, watched like a living thing that could turn against you if ignored. You crouch near the fire pit and feel the ground around it radiating stored heat from the day. Stones that looked ordinary hours ago now glow faintly, holding warmth longer than soil ever could. You angle your body just enough to warm your hands without exposing your face too fully. Burned skin does nothing to help cold nights. It is well documented that miners quickly learned to treat fire as a resource rather than a comfort. Camp records and supply lists show careful tracking of fuel, especially in areas where trees were sparse or already stripped bare. Firewood was counted, guarded, sometimes argued over. Heat had a price. You feed the fire slowly, one small piece at a time. Too much and it burns hot and fast, leaving nothing for later. Too little, and the flame weakens, forcing you to use more energy, coaxing it back. There is a rhythm to this that you begin to feel rather than think through. Add wood. Wait, listen, adjust. Around you, others mirror the same behaviour. Someone pokes the coals just enough to increase airflow. Another shields the flame from wind with their body. Nobody speaks much. Conversation wastes breath and attention. Fire demands both. The sound of it becomes familiar. A soft crackle, occasional pops as resin ignites, a low shifting hum as embers settle. These sounds anchor you. They tell you the fire is alive and working. Silence from the pit would be far more alarming. Some historical accounts mention miners sleeping with one eye half open, waking instinctively when firelight dimmed too quickly. It was not paranoia. A fire going out too early meant hours of deep cold ahead. Better to wake briefly and feed it than to wake later shaking uncontrollably. An unusual anecdote from a California camp describes men placing reflective metal pans behind fires to push heat forward into shelters. The effectiveness was limited, but the idea reveals how carefully people studied the behaviour of warmth. Even marginal gains mattered. There is disagreement among scholars about how often fires were kept burning continuously through the night. Some argue that fuel scarcity made this rare. Others believe shared watch systems allowed at least one fire to remain active in most camps. The truth likely varied by location, season, and population size. You take note of where you sit, close enough to feel heat, far enough to avoid sparks. Clothing dries here, slowly releasing dampness that would otherwise steal warmth later. Steam rises faintly from fabric. The smell is sharp but welcome. Dryness is survival. Fire also shapes social space. Those closest to it tend to be those who contributed most fuel or effort. New arrivals hover at the edges, warming hands briefly before retreating. This is not cruelty, it is necessity expressed quietly. As the night deepens, the fire becomes smaller but more efficient. Embers glow red and steady. This is the phase you learn to value most. Flames dance unpredictably. Coals hold heat patiently. You arrange stones to trap that heat, extending its usefulness. A lesser-known detail from camp sketches shows fire pits dug slightly below ground level, reducing wind exposure and helping embers last longer. This small architectural choice made nights more manageable and was copied wherever possible. You feel your body responding. Hands loosen, shoulders drop, breathing slows. The fire cannot make you comfortable, but it can keep you functional. That distinction matters. Eventually, you move back toward shelter, carrying warmth with you in memory and in slightly heated clothing. The fire continues without you, watched by someone else now. Responsibility passes quietly, without ceremony. Inside, the absence of a flame feels immediate. Shadows still flicker faintly through canvas or gaps in wood. The fire's presence lingers, not as heat, but as reassurance. It is there. It will be there again. You lie down knowing you will wake at least once more before morning. not fully awake, just enough to listen, just enough to sense whether the fire still breathes. This is how nights are survived here, not by defeating the cold, but by pacing it. Fire does not rest, and neither do you. You simply take turns. By the fifth evening, you start counting wood the way other people count coins. Not out loud, not formally, but instinctively. Each log, each branch, each split piece carries a number in your mind. You notice how heavy it feels in your hands, how dry it sounds when knocked together, how quickly it might burn. Fuel scarcity is no longer an abstract worry. It shapes every decision after sunset. You walk farther from camp during daylight, now not chasing gold for an hour or two, but scanning the ground for usable wood. Fallen branches matter. Dead standing trees matter even more. Green wood is heavy and stubborn, reluctant to burn, but sometimes it is all there is. You learn to stack it separately, to dry it as best you can, to mix it carefully with better fuel at night. A commonly acknowledged reality of mountain mining camps is that nearby timber was often exhausted within weeks. Early arrivals burned freely, later arrivals paid the price. Entire hillsides were stripped bare, leaving camps exposed to wind and forcing longer daily journeys just to keep fires alive. You feel that pressure now as dusk approaches and the pile beside your shelter looks smaller than it should. There is a particular kind of unease that comes with knowing warmth has a measurable limit. You calculate hours instead of comfort. If you burn this much now, what happens at 3 in the morning? If you save too much, will the cold take more than it gives back? People develop routines around this. Fires are strongest at the beginning of the night, when everyone is awake and active. Later, they are allowed to shrink. Embers are coaxed rather than fed. You learn to read their colour the way they glow deeper red when they still have life left. An overlooked but telling detail from camp supply lists shows that wood sometimes became a trade good exchanged for food or labour. Warmth could be bought, sold and negotiated. In some camps, disputes over firewood were more common than arguments over gold claims. You notice how behaviour shifts when fuel runs low. People move less. Voices quiet earlier. Meals are eaten closer together, bodies sharing heat by accident and intention. Cold tightens social space without needing permission. There is still debate among researchers about whether miners consciously rationed firewood or simply reacted instinctively to scarcity. Some accounts describe deliberate night plans. Others suggest habits formed without explicit discussion. Standing here feeding a fire one careful piece at a time, the line between planning and instinct feels thin. You experiment. Tonight you push the fire harder, early on, letting it warm stones and ground thoroughly. Later, you rely on that stored heat while keeping the flames low. It is not perfect, but it stretches the night. Small successes feel enormous here. A curious anecdote from a Rocky Mountain camp mentions men burning dried animal dung when wood ran out. The smell was unpleasant, but it burned steadily and produced usable heat. Desperation broadens definitions of fuel quickly. You become more aware of sound. Dry wood snaps sharply. Damp wood hisses and smokes. The fire tells you what you are burning if you listen. You adjust accordingly, learning through repetition rather than instruction. As the night wears on, you feel the absence of abundance. Back home, warmth was assumed. Here it is earned daily. That realization humbles even the most optimistic among you. Gold feels distant when your fingers ache from cold. Eventually, you retreat into shelter earlier than before. There is no sense wasting fuel on empty air. Inside, you arrange yourself carefully, using clothing and blankets to compensate for weaker fire. Every layer matters more now. You sleep lightly again, waking briefly when the cold sharpens. Each time you resist feeding the fire unless absolutely necessary. You are learning restraint, a skill not often celebrated, but deeply valuable. Morning arrives slowly. The fire has survived the night barely. The fuel pile is smaller, but not gone. That feels like victory. You step outside into thin light breath, fogging and plan your day around wood as much as gold. Scarcity has taught you something important. Survival here is not about one perfect solution. It is about many small adjustments made continuously. Tonight you will do this again, a little wiser, a little more careful. By now, you dress with intention rather than habit. Clothing is no longer about appearance or even comfort. It is equipment. Each layer has a purpose, and you learn that purpose through cold fingers and stiff joints. You pull on garments in a specific order, testing weight and flexibility, already thinking about how they will feel 12 hours from now when the temperature bottoms out. Most miners arrived with clothing meant for travel or work, not prolonged exposure to mountain nights. A well-established historical detail is that wool dominated cold weather survival in these camps. Wool shirts, wool trousers, wool socks, often layered despite itchiness and bulk. Wool held warmth even when damp, a quality cotton and linen could not match. You discover this difference the hard way. You start with whatever touches your skin, a shirt already stiff with sweat from the day's labour. Sweat is a hidden enemy. When activity stops, moisture steals heat rapidly. You try to dry garments near the fire before nightfall, turning them slowly, careful not to scorch fabric or waste fuel. Dry cloth feels almost luxurious when you put it back on. Over that comes heavier layers. Vests, jackets, coats sometimes mismatched and worn thin at the elbows. Buttons are precious. Missing one creates a gap that cold exploits mercilessly. You tuck fabric in where you can, reducing openings where air might circulate. There is scholarly disagreement about how standardized miner clothing became as camps matured. Some historians suggest a recognizable uniform emerged. Others argue improvisation always dominated. Looking around, you see both. One man wears a long wool coat meant for city winters. Another layers shirts beneath a canvas jacket, patched repeatedly. Survival does not require elegance. You pay particular attention to your feet. Cold travels upward relentlessly. Socks are doubled if possible. Boots are loosened slightly to avoid restricting circulation, then retightened just enough for stability. You learn to check them at night because numbness hides damage until morning. A curious side note from personal letters describes miners stuffing paper or spare cloth into boots as extra insulation. Newspapers, letters from home, even discarded claim notices found second lives between leather and skin. Warmth outweighed sentimentality. Hands present another problem. Gloves reduce dexterity, bare fingers freeze quickly. You alternate warming hands near the fire, then working briefly without protection before retreating again. At night you sleep with hands tucked close to your core elbows, drawn in preserving heat where blood flow matters most. Hats become essential. Heat escapes upward faster than you expect. A hat pulled low over ears makes a noticeable difference. Some men sleep with scarves wrapped around their heads, breathing through cloth to slightly warm the air before it reaches lungs. It feels strange at first, then normal. There is ongoing debate among scholars about whether miners intuitively understood heat loss or learned entirely through experience. There were no manuals here. Knowledge spread through observation, imitation, and failure. You watch what works for others and quietly adopt it. You notice how clothing changes posture. Heavy layers stiffen movement. Bending becomes slower. Sitting requires adjustment, but stiffness is preferable to shivering. You accept reduced flexibility as the cost of warmth. As night settles, you feel the combined weight of fabric pressing inward. It is not comfortable in a modern sense, but it is reassuring. Pressure means insulation. Stillness becomes easier when movement costs warmth. A lesser-known detail appears in a few camp records, mentioning the use of animal grease rubbed into boots or outer garments to repel moisture and wind. The smell lingered, but the added resistance helped during storms and freezing rain. Comfort yielded to function without hesitation. When you finally lie down, fully clothed, you feel oddly prepared. Not safe, not warm, but equipped. The cold presses against layers rather than skin, and that difference matters more than you would have believed a week ago. Sleep arrives unevenly, but when it comes, it lasts slightly longer. Your body wastes less energy fighting exposure. Clothing has become a barrier, imperfect but effective. Morning greets you with stiffness rather than misery. You stretch slowly, letting blood return to extremities. The clothes that protected you through the night now feel heavy damp, in places tired. They did their job. You stand and face another day, knowing tonight will demand the same careful ritual. Dressing here is not routine. It is preparation for survival, repeated daily until it becomes instinct. When night comes again, you feel the difference immediately. Not in the air, but beneath you. Someone has added weight to the sleeping space. Blankets layered thicker than before. Animal hides stiff at the edges, softer, where bodies have already warmed them. You lower yourself carefully, testing the surface, with a hand first feeling how it resists the cold better than bare ground ever did. Blankets here are not decorative objects. They are tools traded, borrowed, argued over. A broadly recognized historical pattern shows that bedding was among the most valuable personal items miners owned. Some arrived with only one thin blanket. Others carried several, knowing full well that gold did not matter if you froze before you found it. You arrange the layers slowly, wool against wool, hide on top or sometimes beneath fur, turned inward to trap air. The smell is unmistakable. Animal smoke dampness. It would be unpleasant anywhere else. Here it means warmth. You pull the covering up to your chin and feel the weight settle, pressing heat back toward your body rather than letting it drift away. You notice how sharing changes everything. Two bodies under one set of blankets warm the space faster than one. There is an unspoken understanding about this. Privacy fades quickly in cold camps. Survival outranks modesty. You turn slightly back to back or side by side, positioning yourselves to minimize gaps. A fact often mentioned in camp correspondence is that shared bedding became common, not out of friendship, but practicality. Space was limited, supplies were scarce, body heat was free. This arrangement was rarely sentimental and almost never comfortable at first, but it worked. You shift as the hide beneath you creaks softly. It does not compress the way wool does. It cushions, then settles, holding warmth more stubbornly. You can feel the difference through your clothing. The cold still exists, but it has been slowed, interrupted. An unusual anecdote recorded in one miner journal describes a man sewing together several small hides to create a patchwork sleeping layer. The stitching was rough and uneven, but he claimed it kept him warmer than any single blanket he owned. Ingenuity flourished where necessity demanded it. There is scholarly discussion about how widely animal skins were used across different camps. Some researchers argue they were rare and expensive. Others point to hunting records and trade with local trappers, suggesting hides were more common than previously thought. From your position, half wrapped in fur, the debate feels secondary to the result. You notice how the weight of the blankets affects your breathing. It slows you down. Each inhale feels deliberate. Each exhale warms the space beneath the covers slightly more. This is not accidental. Stillness conserves heat. Movement lets it escape. Feet are always the hardest to manage. You tuck them deeper, crossing ankles, pressing soles together. Someone nearby slides closer, sharing warmth without comment. The blankets shift, sealing gaps. The cold outside remains sharp, but it no longer feels personal. A quirky detail from a later recollection mentions miners using spare sacks, filled with leaves or straw, as additional padding beneath bedding. It was not soft, but it created another insulating layer between body and ground. Comfort was measured differently here. As the night progresses, you wake briefly when someone adjusts position. The hide rustles. The blankets lift and settle again. You feel heat escape momentarily, then return. These small disturbances are accepted without complaint. Everyone understands the trade-off. Sleep comes deeper now, not uninterrupted, but less fragile. Your body spends less energy fighting exposure. Dreams begin to stretch slightly longer, though they remain muted. Warmth allows imagination a bit more room to wander. By morning, condensation has formed on the inside of canvas or along wooden walls. Your blankets are damp at the edges. Dryness is temporary here. Still, you wake less stiff than before. That feels like progress. You roll out carefully, reluctant to abandon the pocket of warmth you helped create overnight. The air outside the covers feels sharper by contrast. You dress fully before standing, trapping as much heat as possible. As you step into the pale morning light, you glance back at the heap of blankets and hides. They look crude, heavy, unrefined, and yet they carried you through another mountain night. Warmth here is not elegant. It is layered, shared, and constantly adjusted. Tonight you will arrange it again, knowing exactly how much it matters. You begin to understand that darkness here is never complete. Night settles in layers rather than all at once, and sleep follows the same pattern. You lie down expecting rest, but what arrives instead is a shallow drifting state where awareness never fully lets go. Wind presses against the shelter in pulses. Fabric sighs. Wood ticks softly as it cools. These sounds do not wake you so much as keep you from sinking too far. A widely accepted observation, drawn from miners' letters, is that uninterrupted sleep was rare in high mountain camps. People describe nights as something they passed through rather than slept through. Rest came in fragments, stitched together by brief returns to consciousness. This was not considered abnormal. It was simply how nights worked here. You find yourself listening without trying. The fire outside shifts. Someone coughs. A distant shout carries strangely far in thin air, then disappears. Every sound feels closer than it should, magnified by cold and quiet. Your body stays ready, even while lying still. You adjust your position slightly, then freeze, waiting for warmth to settle again. Movement costs heat. You learn to move less but more deliberately. Each small adjustment is followed by patience, as blankets and hides slowly trap warmth again. The absence of true darkness plays a role. Stars burn sharply overhead, their light slipping through gaps in canvas or between roof planks. Moonlight reflects off frost, casting a pale glow that outlines shapes inside the shelter. Your eyes open and close without effort, never fully surrendering. There remains debate among sleep historians about whether this pattern resembles what some call segmented sleep, or whether it is simply a response to environmental stress. Some argue miners naturally fell into cycles of light sleep and waking. Others believe cold and noise forced it. Lying here, the distinction feels unnecessary. The result is the same. You notice how time stretches at night. Minutes feel longer. Hours lose definition. Without clocks, you judge progress by temperature shifts and sound. When the fire crackles less frequently, you know embers are settling. When wind slackens, you know dawn may be approaching, even if the sky still looks dark. An odd detail mentioned in one camp memoir describes miners marking time at night by listening for animals. Horses shifting before morning feeding, birds stirring just before first light. These subtle cues replaced watches and bells, offering reassurance that the night was moving forward. You wake briefly again, not startled, just alert. Someone outside adds wood to the fire. Sparks lift, then fade. You feel a brief wash of heat, then its gradual retreat. That moment becomes a kind of checkpoint. The night has turned another corner. Inside the shelter, breath hangs faintly in the air before dissolving. Condensation dampens fabric and hair. You pull blankets higher, breathing more slowly. Each breath warms the pocket around your face, just enough to matter. A point often overlooked in popular retellings is that miners did not expect comfort at night. Survival manuals of the era barely addressed sleep quality in such conditions. Endurance mattered more than restfulness. You internalize this quickly. Wanting deep sleep only leads to frustration. You drift again, thoughts loosening but not disappearing. Memories surface without context. A kitchen back home, warm bread, voices unconnected to faces. Cold reshapes imagination, smoothing edges, slowing scenes. Dreams here feel heavier, anchored by physical sensation. Scholars continue to discuss whether prolonged exposure to cold altered miners' sleep cycles long-term. Some accounts suggest adaptation over weeks. Others describe chronic exhaustion that never fully lifted. For many, the gold rush was brief. Long-term effects remained undocumented. You wake once more when a gust rattles the shelter harder than usual. The sound passes, silence returns. You wait, counting breaths until tension fades. This waiting becomes routine. It does not feel anxious anymore, just attentive. Eventually, without fanfare, the night begins to loosen its grip. The cold remains, but it shifts character. Less sharp, more diffuse. You sense it before seeing it. A change in the air, a subtle softening. You open your eyes and realize you have been asleep longer than you thought. Not deeply, but enough. Enough to function, enough to rise when needed. That is the standard here. Morning will bring noise, movement, and the promise of warmth that never fully delivers. For now, you remain still, wrapped and breathing suspended between dark and light. This is sleep in the mountain camps. Not an escape, but a negotiation. And each night you learn to bargain a little better. By the time you wake fully the next morning, you realize the cold has done more than chill your skin. It has settled deeper into breath and muscle, into the slow rhythm of movement itself. Standing feels heavier than it should. Each step takes a fraction more effort. The air up here is thinner, and at night that thinness becomes impossible to ignore. Altitude does not announce itself dramatically. It whispers. Your lungs work harder for the same reward. Your heart beats a little faster, even when you are still. Add cold to that equation, and the strain multiplies quietly. A widely acknowledged reality of high mountain camps is that many miners underestimated how exhausting nights could be simply because of where they were sleeping, not what they were doing. You notice it when you bend to pick something up and feel a brief lightness in your head. When you climb a small rise that would have been nothing back home and feel breath shorten unexpectedly. Cold tightens blood vessels. Thin air demands more oxygen. Together they ask more from your body while offering less in return. During the day, movement helps. Muscles generate heat, blood circulates. But at night, stillness allows altitude to assert itself. Lying down, you sometimes feel your breathing change, becoming shallower without you choosing it. You correct it consciously. At first, then trust your body to find a rhythm that works. Personal accounts from miners often mention waking with headaches that faded as the day progressed. This has been linked by modern researchers to altitude effects rather than illness. At the time, it was simply accepted as part of camp life, another discomfort layered onto many others. You drink more water than you think you need. Cold blunts thirst, but dehydration worsens the effects of thin air. Someone older or more experienced reminds you to drink anyway. Advice travels quickly here, carried by observation rather than instruction. There remains disagreement among scholars about how quickly miners acclimatized to altitude. Some suggest adaptation happened within days. Others argue many never fully adjusted, especially those moving frequently between elevations. In camps where people came and went constantly, the body rarely found equilibrium. At night, you feel altitude most when lying still. The cold keeps you awake, just enough to notice your breathing. You draw air in, slowly feeling it cool your throat. Exhale and warmth briefly returns. The contrast sharpens awareness. An unusual but telling detail appears in one mining camp letter, describing men sleeping, propped up on packs or rolled clothing to ease breathing. Elevation of the upper body helped some feel less strained during the night. It was not comfortable, but it reduced the sense of air hunger enough to matter. You adjust your sleeping position now with that in mind. A slight incline, shoulders supported, head higher than feet. It changes the way blankets settle, the way warmth pulls, but breathing feels steadier. You accept the trade. The cold amplifies every physical signal. A tight chest feels tighter. A shallow breath feels shallower. You remind yourself that this is not panic. It is environment. Understanding that difference prevents fear from taking hold. By the fire, you notice others stretching more deliberately than before. Movements are slower in the morning, joints stiff from both cold and thin air. Nobody rushes. Rushing wastes energy. A small but revealing observation from camp sketches shows men often gathering near fires at dawn, not just for warmth, but to breathe more easily. Heat slightly expands air, and standing close to flame offered subtle relief, whether consciously understood or not. As night comes again, altitude asserts itself once more. You lie down, aware that sleep may feel different here than it ever did below. Dreams remain light. Breathing remains present in your awareness. You do not fight it anymore, you accommodate it. Cold and altitude together shape a specific kind of fatigue. It is not the sharp exhaustion of hard labor alone. It is a dull, constant drain. Learning to survive it means pacing yourself, not just physically, but mentally. You accept that some nights will leave you more tired than rested, that tomorrow's work will feel heavier than it should. This acceptance is not resignation, it is adaptation. As you close your eyes, wrapped and breathing steadily, you feel your body settling into a new normal. Not comfortable, not ideal, but functional. The mountain does not change, you do, and each night you spend here teaches you how. As evening settles again, you notice how hunger feels different in the cold. It is sharper, more insistent, and oddly specific. Your body does not just want food, it wants fuel that lasts. You gravitate toward whatever is warm, heavy, and filling, knowing instinctively that what you eat now will shape how the night treats you. In mountain camps, dinner happens earlier than it might elsewhere. Once darkness falls, movement slows and priorities narrow. A well-supported historical observation is that miners relied heavily on calorie-dense meals in the evening, understanding through experience that warmth could be generated from within as much as from fire. Beans, bread, salted meat, and whatever fat could be spared became nighttime allies. You sit near a pot that has been simmering all afternoon. The smell is thick and comforting. Steam curls upward, carrying heat that warms your face before the food ever reaches your mouth. You eat slowly, not from politeness, but because chewing takes effort in the cold, and you want to savor every bit of warmth it offers. Fat matters more than flavor here. Bacon, grease, lard, tallow. These ingredients stretch meals and bodies alike. You feel the difference almost immediately, a subtle spreading warmth that settles deeper than fire ever reaches. It does not eliminate the cold, but it gives your body something to work with. Accounts from the period frequently note that men who skipped meals or tried to conserve food suffered more at night than those who ate fully, even when supplies were low. Hunger and cold compound each other. You learn quickly not to let one weaken your defense against the other. You drink something warm if possible, coffee or tea if available, sometimes just hot water, flavored faintly by whatever vessel it was boiled in last. The warmth spreads through your chest, easing, breathing, loosening tightness. It feels temporary, but even temporary relief is valuable. There is still discussion among historians about how balanced miner diets actually were. Some argue that meals were monotonous and nutritionally poor. Others point out that caloric intake was often surprisingly high, even if vitamins were lacking. From your perspective, warmth matters more than balance tonight. A curious detail from a miner diary describes men saving a portion of their evening meal to eat during the night if they woke cold. The act of chewing and swallowing combined with digestion provided a brief boost of internal heat. It was not elegant, but it was effective enough to repeat. You notice how the camp quiets as people finish eating. Bellies full, movements slow. The fire seems brighter by contrast. This is the most comfortable moment of the night, brief and fragile. You are aware it will not last. As you settle into shelter, you feel the food working. Muscles relax slightly. Shivering, if it had begun, eases. Your body diverts energy, inward digesting, generating warmth. This internal fire feels steadier than flames outside. An often overlooked fact in popular retellings is that miners sometimes timed their heaviest meals specifically to coincide with the coldest part of the night. Supper was not just about hunger, it was about strategy. Eating too early meant losing the benefit by dawn. Eating too late risked wasting fuel and light. You lie down, aware of how your breathing feels fuller, deeper. The cold still presses in from all sides, but it meets resistance now. You curl slightly, letting digestion and insulation work together. Scholars continue to debate how much of miners' cold tolerance came from diet versus acclimatization. Some suggest increased fat consumption played a significant role. Others argue behavioral adaptation mattered more. The truth likely lives in the overlap. During the night, you wake briefly and feel hunger again, faint but present. You resist the urge to eat more, saving supplies. Instead, you adjust blankets and focus on breathing slowly, letting digestion finish its work. Morning brings a different kind of hunger, sharp and immediate. You rise knowing the cycle will repeat. Work burns calories. Cold demands replacement. Food becomes a rhythm that shapes both day and night. As you step outside, the memory of warmth from last night's meal lingers just enough to encourage you. You plan your day around food as much as around golden wood. Survival here is a triangle. Shelter, fire, nourishment. Remove one and the other's strain. Tonight, when darkness returns, you will eat again with intention. Not indulgence, preparation, because in the mountains, warmth begins on the tongue and ends somewhere deep inside, long after the fire has faded. As night settles again, a familiar bottle makes its way around the fire. You recognize it immediately, not by sight, but by the way people react to it. Shoulders loosen, voices lift slightly. Someone laughs a little louder than necessary. The idea that alcohol brings warmth is deeply rooted here, carried from older traditions and half-remembered advice. You feel the temptation too. A swallow promises comfort, or at least the illusion of it. Many miners believed strongly that liquor helped them endure cold nights. This belief was widespread across camps and social classes, passed along as common sense rather than questioned. Whiskey, rum, brandy, whatever was available, became part of evening routines for some. The sensation was convincing, a quick flush, a spreading heat. For a moment, the cold seemed pushed back. You take a small drink and feel it immediately. Warmth blooms in your chest and face. Muscles relax. The edge of the night softens. It feels like relief. That feeling, however, is misleading. Modern medical understanding tells us that alcohol increases blood flow to the skin, creating a sensation of warmth, while actually accelerating heat loss. The body feels warmer while becoming colder. Of course, nobody here explains it that way. They explain it through experience, through nights that end worse than they begin. Some miners learned quickly to limit their drinking after dark. Others did not. Personal accounts describe men who drank heavily before sleep and woke dangerously cold, disoriented, sometimes unable to stop shivering. The bottle did not protect them. It betrayed them quietly. There remains ongoing scholarly discussion about how aware miners were of alcohol's true effects. Some historians argue that experienced outdoorsmen understood the risks and drank sparingly. Others believe the myth persisted, widely reinforced by short-term sensation and social pressure. Watching the bottle pass, you see both caution and hope in equal measure. You decide to stop after one small drink. The warmth fades slowly, replaced by a subtle chill that feels sharper by contrast. You pull your coat tighter and move closer to the fire, silently acknowledging the trade you just made. A curious detail from a Nevada camp journal mentions a group of miners deliberately switching to hot tea at night, after noticing fewer cases of severe cold among themselves. Tea lacked the immediate thrill of spirits, but it did not lie about its effects. The change reportedly improved sleep and reduced morning stiffness. You notice how those who continue drinking grow less attentive. They sit too close to sparks, forget to adjust blankets, fall asleep before arranging their bedding properly. Alcohol dulls judgment, and cold exploits that dullness patiently. There is also the social aspect. Drinking creates connection. Stories flow more easily. Laughter comes quicker. In an environment, this harsh emotional warmth carries its own value. You understand why people reach for it, even knowing the risks. As the night deepens, you watch someone stumble slightly while moving toward shelter. Others steady him without comment. This is not uncommon. Camp life includes quiet acts of support that never make it into official records. You settle into your sleeping space sober, more alert to your body's signals. Cold still presses in, but you feel capable of responding. You adjust layers, tuck in edges, focus on breathing. Control feels valuable tonight. During the night, you wake briefly and notice the difference. Your head is clear. Movements are coordinated. You can sense where warmth is leaking and correct it. The cold is still there, but you are not confused by it. By morning, the contrast becomes clearer. Those who drank heavily complain of worse cold, deeper fatigue headaches that linger longer than usual. No one lectures them. Experience does that work silently. This lesson settles in slowly. Alcohol offers comfort, but it demands payment later. Some decide the trade is worth it. Others, like you, become more selective. As you step into the pale morning light, you feel steady, if tired. You remember the warmth of the fire, the weight of blankets, the quiet rhythm of breathing through the night. Not everything that feels good helps you survive here. The mountain rewards clarity more than bravado. Tonight, when the bottle appears again, you will remember this feeling. And you will choose accordingly, knowing that in the cold honesty matters more than illusion. By the 12th night, you no longer think of space the way you used to. Distance feels wasteful. Empty air feels extravagant. You measure comfort by proximity now, by how close another body sits or sleeps, by how tightly the shelter gathers everyone together. Warmth has rewritten your sense of personal boundaries. In many mountain camps, sleeping alone became a rarity rather than a preference. Contemporary observers noted that crowded tents and shared bunks were the norm, not the exception. This was not driven by friendliness so much as physics. Two bodies produce more heat than one, and heat lingers longer when there is less space to escape into. You feel it as soon as you settle in. The shelter warms faster tonight, not because the fire is stronger, but because there are more people inside. Breath thickens the air slightly. Movement becomes careful, coordinated. Everyone learns to shift without creating drafts. You lie shoulder to shoulder, back to back, sometimes even foot to foot, arranging yourselves like pieces in a puzzle, designed to waste nothing. At first, this closeness felt awkward. Now it feels efficient, necessary. The cold outside does not care about comfort, and neither can you. A detail often overlooked in popular stories is how quickly social norms adapted to these conditions. Men who would have guarded their personal space fiercely elsewhere accepted shared bedding here without comment. Survival reshaped etiquette faster than any formal rule ever could. You notice how heat migrates. The person in the center sleeps better. Those on the edges feel the cold first. Positions shift quietly during the night. Fairness negotiated without words. Everyone understands the logic. No one wants to be the one shivering awake. There remains an unresolved discussion among historians about whether this closeness led to increased conflict or greater cooperation overall. Some accounts describe tensions and arguments. Others emphasize mutual reliance and silent understanding. From where you lie wrapped in shared warmth, cooperation feels more visible than conflict. The sounds change too. Breathing overlaps. Coughs ripple through the shelter. Someone murmurs in their sleep. These noises would be intrusive elsewhere. Here they are reassuring. They mean people are still warm enough to breathe deeply. An odd recollection from a mining camp in the Sierra Nevada describes men timing their sleep so that at least one person remained awake at any given hour, tending the fire or adjusting blankets. This created a rotating awareness that reduced sudden cold shocks. It was not planned formally, it emerged naturally. You find yourself waking when someone shifts not out of irritation, but awareness. The movement signals a change in heat distribution. You respond instinctively, pulling blankets tighter, tucking fabric, closing gaps. Sharing space also means sharing smells. Sweat, smoke, damp wool, animal hide. These scents blend into something distinctively camp-like. Unpleasant at first, then neutral, then almost comforting. Smell becomes another sign that warmth has been here. Some scholars continue to debate whether crowded sleeping conditions increased illness in camps. Evidence suggests sickness spread more easily, but the alternative may have been worse. Exposure to cold carried its own risks. Warmth came at a cost, and miners chose it anyway. As the night deepens, you feel the collective heat stabilize. The shelter no longer loses warmth as quickly. Blankets grow heavier, damp at the edges, but warm at the center. Your breathing slows, sinking unconsciously with those around you. You drift in and out of sleep, but the waking moments feel less lonely now. There is comfort in knowing others are enduring the same night beside you. Cold isolates individuals. Shared warmth counters that isolation. Morning arrives gradually. Bodies stir. Someone stretches, bumping an elbow. Another groans softly. Laughter breaks out briefly when someone realizes how tightly everyone has packed together. Humor returns with light. You step outside into the cold air and feel how sharply it contrasts with the shared warmth you just left. The memory of that closeness lingers like an afterimage. You understand now why miners tolerated it night after night. In these camps, warmth is not private, it is collective. You survive the coldest hours not alone but pressed close to others who are doing the same. Tonight, when darkness falls again, you will gather in knowing exactly why. The weather turns without warning, the way it always seems to in the mountains. One evening feels almost familiar, cold but manageable, and the next arrives carrying something sharper. You notice it first in the sky. Clouds stack higher than usual. The air feels heavier, as if holding its breath. By the time darkness settles, snow begins to fall, not gently, but with intent. Sudden storms were a defining feature of life in many gold rush regions, especially at elevation. Records from the period describe snow arriving weeks earlier than expected, or storms forming overnight with little notice. Camps that felt merely uncomfortable one evening could become dangerous by morning. You feel the shift immediately. Wind drives flakes sideways, finding every seam an opening. The shelter that held well enough last night now rattles and flexes under pressure. Canvas snaps sharply. Wooden walls groan as gusts push against them. Cold no longer seeps, it attacks. Movement outside becomes risky. Snow hides uneven ground. Ice forms quickly where people walked earlier. You hear someone slip and curse softly, more annoyed than injured, but the sound carries a warning. Night travel is no longer an option unless absolutely necessary. Inside, everyone grows quieter. Fires are fed more carefully, larger but steadier. Wood is shielded from moisture. Someone shakes snow from a coat before entering the sound, sharp and hollow. Wet fabric becomes an enemy faster than cold itself. An interesting, but lesser known detail from storm accounts mentions miners digging shallow trenches around shelters to divert meltwater away. Even in freezing conditions, snow could melt slightly against warmer ground, or fire-heated walls, sending water inward if not redirected. Small actions prevented large problems. You pile more insulation beneath you. Straw, branches, spare sacks. Anything that lifts you from the ground helps. Snow outside actually changes the acoustics of the night. Sound dulls, wind still howls, but footsteps vanish. The world feels wrapped muted. There remains debate among historians about whether miners recognized the insulating potential of snow early on. Some argue they saw only its dangers. Others point to evidence of shelters deliberately banked with snow to block drafts. Tonight you experience both sides. Snow piles against the walls, and inside the wind feels slightly less vicious. You listen as flakes thud softly against canvas and wood. The rhythm becomes hypnotic. Firelight flickers more urgently now, shadows jumping faster. Someone adjusts the fire, careful not to waste fuel, but unwilling to let it fade too far. A quirky recollection from a Utah camp describes miners waking to find their shelters nearly buried, emerging through makeshift tunnels dug by hand. At first panic set in. Then they noticed the interior had stayed warmer than expected. Snow had sealed gaps that wind once exploited. Inside your shelter, breath fogs more heavily. Moisture builds. You wipe your face with a sleeve and feel dampness immediately. Dryness is gone. You accept it. Managing moisture becomes the new challenge. Wet clothing must be dried carefully or swapped out. Some items are set near the fire, rotated slowly. Scholars continue to discuss how much these sudden storms contributed to camp mortality. Some suggest exposure during unexpected snowfall caused numerous deaths. Others argue the real danger came afterward when supplies ran low or travel routes were cut off. Either way, storms reshaped camp life abruptly. You lie down knowing this night will be different. The cold feels deeper, but oddly more stable. Snow insulates even as it threatens. The fire becomes the center of everything. No one strays far from it now. Sleep is lighter than usual. The storm keeps you alert. You wake whenever wind gusts spike, when snow slides off the roof in a soft rush. Each sound signals change. You listen, evaluate, then settle again. At one point, someone suggests adding snow to the fire perimeter to control sparks and reflect heat inward. The idea works partially. Steam rises. Heat feels more contained. Improvisation becomes instinctive. By morning, the camp looks transformed. Snow blankets everything, softening edges, hiding scars. The cold remains severe, but the wind has calmed. Inside the shelter, you realize you survived the worst of it, not by fighting the storm, but by adapting to its presence. You step outside into blinding white light. Footprints are shallow memories. Smoke rises straight up now, no longer torn sideways. The night has passed. Storms like this teach another lesson. Comfort here is temporary. Stability is an illusion. Survival depends on flexibility, on noticing change early and responding without panic. Tonight may be calm again, or it may not. The mountain decides. You simply prepare. Knowing that when weather turns suddenly, the coldest nights demand the clearest thinking. When darkness returns after the storm, the camp sounds different. Metal speaks more clearly now. Tools left outside all day ring sharply when touched, as if protesting the cold. You hear it when someone lifts a shovel or shifts a pan near the fire. The sound is brittle, almost glass-like. Cold has changed not just the air, but the voice of everything in it. Tools were never meant to rest at night, yet here they remain scattered around shelters, leaning against posts, half buried in snow or dirt. A well-known aspect of mining camp life is that tools were too valuable and too numerous to store properly. They stayed close exposed to the elements, becoming part of the nighttime environment, whether you wanted them there or not. You notice how the cold affects them. Wood handles shrink slightly, loosening metal heads. Leather straps stiffen, resisting movement. Iron contracts, becoming sharper to the touch. You learn to test a grip before trusting it, especially in the dark where a slip can mean injury you cannot easily treat. The sounds continue as the temperature drops. Wood creaks, nails shift. The shelter settles like a living thing adjusting its weight. These noises wake you briefly, not out of fear, but curiosity. Each sound tells you something about the cold's progress. Some miners learned to bring smaller tools inside at night, not for use but for warmth. Keeping a hammer or knife close to the fire prevented it from freezing solid, making morning work easier. This practice appears repeatedly in camp recollections, especially during harsher seasons. There is debate among historians about whether tool-related injuries increase during cold nights. Some evidence suggests frozen hands and stiff equipment led to accidents at dawn. Other records point to fatigue as the larger factor. Either way, the night set the stage for what followed. You run a hand along a wooden handle and feel how dry and cold it has become. The texture is different, rougher, less forgiving. You make a mental note to warm it slightly before using it tomorrow. These small considerations stack up, shaping how you move through each day. An unusual but telling detail from one mining sketch shows tools laid out deliberately near sleeping areas, not to clutter space but to keep them within reach and awareness. Knowing where everything was mattered more at night when visibility dropped and movement slowed. Inside the shelter, metal objects cool the air around them. You notice it when your elbow brushes a pan or your foot touches a shovel blade. Cold transfers instantly, startling you awake for a moment. You adjust placement pushing tools farther away, creating a small zone meant only for bodies. Tools also shape sound beyond your shelter. A loose pick clanks softly in the wind. A bucket shifts against a post. These noises carry far in cold air, sometimes mistaken for movement or voices. You learn to identify them quickly so they do not pull you fully awake. Scholars still discuss how much nighttime tool awareness affected miners' stress levels. Some argue constant alertness wore people down. Others suggest familiarity reduced anxiety over time. You feel both. At first, every sound demanded attention. Now you sought them almost automatically. As you lie down, you listen to the camp settling again. The storm has passed, but the cold remains. Tools rest where they will be needed again soon. Their presence is both reassuring and demanding. They represent work waiting, Gold's still hidden effort not yet finished. During the night, you wake briefly when a sudden crack echoes nearby. A wooden handle has split under pressure from cold. No one reacts immediately. Breakage is expected here. Repairs will come with daylight. Morning reveals the damage. Small things mostly. Cracked grips, warped boards, nothing catastrophic. You add it to the mental list of tasks, aware that maintenance never stops in this environment. As the sun climbs, metal warms slowly, releasing the cold it held overnight. Tools return to their familiar feel. The sounds soften again, but you remember how they spoke in the dark, how the night claimed even inanimate things. Tonight, when cold returns, you will listen again, not just for wind and fire, but for the quiet language of tools adjusting to the mountain night. As the fire dims and voices fade, a different kind of cold settles in. It is not on your skin or in your lungs. It sits somewhere behind the ribs, quieter but heavier. The night stretches long, and with it comes a silence that feels more personal than the wind ever did. You lie still and realize that warmth is not the only thing missing now. Many miners wrote about loneliness as one of the most difficult parts of camp life, especially at night. This is a well-recognized theme in personal letters and memoirs. The work was communal, the danger shared, but once darkness arrived, thoughts turned inward. In the cold, there was less distraction, fewer tasks to keep the mind busy. You stare up at the dim outline of the shelter roof, tracing familiar cracks and seams with your eyes. These small details become anchors, something to focus on when the mind threatens to wander too far. The fire outside pops softly, then quiets again. The sound fades, and with it a sense of connection. You think of home not in specific images at first, but in sensations. Warm rooms, familiar smells. The weight of blankets that did not smell of smoke or damp hide. These memories arrive uninvited, stirred by contrast. You do not dwell on them too long. Dwelling makes the cold feel sharper. There has been long-standing discussion among historians about whether isolation or physical hardship was more damaging to miners' mental health. Some argue that loneliness broke spirits faster than cold ever could. Others suggest exhaustion left little room for emotional reflection. Lying here awake, the argument feels unresolved. The stars outside seem closer on nights like this. You can see them through gaps, bright and indifferent. They do not blink, they do not soften. Their steadiness makes your own small movements feel temporary. It is both comforting and unsettling. A lesser-known but striking detail appears in one miner journal, describing men talking aloud to themselves at night, not from madness, but to hear a human voice. Whispered comments, recounted plans, simple statements of fact. Sound-proved existence. You listen to the breathing of others nearby. The rhythm reassures you. Even without conversation, shared presence matters. Loneliness eases slightly when you remember you are not enduring this night alone, even if no one is speaking. Sleep comes unevenly. When it does, dreams are quiet, almost colourless. Faces appear without voices, places without warmth. You wake feeling the absence more than the content. Cold has stripped dreams down to their outlines. Scholars continue to debate whether these emotional lows were temporary or left lasting marks. Some miners returned home unchanged. Others carried restlessness with them long after the rush ended. Records do not always capture what lingered inside. You shift slightly and feel the blanket move. The small sound grounds you. You breathe in, count slowly, breathe out. The routine steadies thoughts. The cold recedes just enough to let your mind rest. Eventually, the weight behind your ribs lightens. Fatigue wins over reflection. Sleep settles again, thin but serviceable. Morning will come, and with it noise, purpose, distraction. For now, you remain here in the quiet space between exhaustion and rest, learning that survival is not only about keeping the body warm, it is also about keeping the mind from freezing. The cold evenings begin to fill with sound again, carefully chosen sound. Not the chaotic noise of daytime labour, but something softer shaped to fit the dark. Someone clears their throat near the fire, another hums a tune that never quite forms into a song. Words appear slowly, as if tested against the air before being released. Stories return, because silence has worn thin. It is a firmly established aspect of camp life that storytelling and singing became common nighttime practices in mining settlements. These were not performances meant to impress. They were tools much like blankets or firewood used to push back fear and fatigue. A familiar voice could warm a space almost as effectively as flame. You sit or lie close enough to hear without straining. The fire throws uneven light across faces, exaggerating features, deepening shadows. Someone begins a story you have already heard once or twice, and no one complains. Repetition is part of the comfort. Knowing how a tale ends allows the mind to relax. The stories are rarely about heroism. More often, they circle around absurd moments, minor victories, close calls that ended well enough. Laughter comes quietly at first, then more freely. The sound feels fragile but welcome. It cuts through the cold in a way silence never could. There is continuing academic discussion about whether these nighttime rituals served primarily psychological or social purposes. Some scholars emphasize morale and mental health. Others point to the way shared narratives reinforced group cohesion and informal rules. Sitting here wrapped in layers, you feel both at once. Songs follow stories naturally, simple melodies, familiar rhythms, nothing too loud. The cold carries sound farther than expected, and no one wants to attract attention from neighbouring camps or wandering animals. Voices blend softly, sometimes falling out of sync, sometimes finding harmony by accident. A curious recollection from one miner describes men altering song lyrics to include details from camp life, turning popular tunes into local commentary. It was not meant to last. It existed only for the night, then vanished with sleep. That temporary quality made it more precious. You notice how your body responds. Shoulders loosen, jaw unclenches, breathing slows. The cold remains, but it feels less dominant when attention shifts elsewhere. This is not distraction in the modern sense. It is redirection guiding the mind towards something warmer. As the evening progresses, voices fade naturally. No one announces the end. Stories simply run out. Songs trail off mid-verse. The fire settles lower. Contentment replaces entertainment, and that is enough. You lie back and replay fragments in your mind. A joke, a shared memory, a melody without words. These echoes follow you into sleep, filling the space that loneliness once occupied. Researchers still explore whether camps with stronger social rituals fared better overall. Some evidence suggests lower desertion rates and fewer conflicts. Other data complicates the picture. Human behaviour rarely obeys simple patterns, but warmth of spirit clearly mattered here. You drift into sleep more easily tonight. Dreams carry sound with them. Voices are present, even if indistinct. The cold presses in, but it meets resistance not just from blankets and fire, but from connection. Morning will scatter everyone again, returning focus to individual claims and personal goals. But tonight, shared sound has done its work. As the fire dims to embers and silence returns gently, rather than abruptly, you understand something important. Warmth is not always measured in degrees. Sometimes it is measured in how easily sleep finds you. The cold nights make illness harder to ignore. During the day, aches can be worked through coughing, dismissed as dust or exertion. At night, when bodies are still and the air sharpens every sensation, small problems announce themselves loudly. You hear it in the shelter, the rasp of a throat, the wet hitch in a breath, the long pause before someone exhales again. It is widely recognized by medical historians that mining camps were environments where sickness spread easily, especially during colder months. Crowded sleeping spaces, limited hygiene, and constant exposure created ideal conditions for respiratory illness. Nighttime brought symptoms forward, stripping away distraction. You lie still and listen not out of fear, but awareness. Cold tightens chests and slows circulation. A cough that barely registered during the day now sounds deeper, more urgent. Someone clears their throat repeatedly, trying not to wake others. The effort only draws more attention to the sound. You feel it in yourself too, a stiffness in the neck, a dull ache behind the eyes. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind you that endurance has limits. You pull the blankets higher and breathe more carefully, warming each inhale before it reaches your lungs. A detail found in several camp journals mentions men sleeping with scarves or cloth over their mouths during the coldest nights. The fabric trapped moisture and slightly warmed incoming air. It looked uncomfortable, but many swore it reduced morning soreness and coughing. There has been ongoing debate among historians about whether illness in camps was driven more by cold exposure or by sanitation failures. Some argue that low temperatures weakened immune response. Others point to contaminated water and poor waste management as primary causes. Lying here hearing coughs echo softly, it feels like an interaction of both. The shelter smells heavier tonight. Breath and damp fabric mix, creating a thickened atmosphere. Ventilation matters, but opening flaps invites cold. You weigh the options, cracking and opening just enough to let air move without losing too much heat. Balance becomes instinctive. You notice how people behave around sickness. Quiet adjustments. Someone offers an extra blanket without comment. Another moves closer to share warmth. No one speaks of weakness. Illness is treated as temporary, something to be managed rather than judged. A lesser-known account from a Montana camp describes miners rotating sleeping positions so that someone coughing heavily would not remain on the cold edge of a shelter all night. It was a small act, but it reduced suffering. These gestures rarely appear in official records. As the night deepens, sounds settle into rhythm. Coughing becomes less frequent, breathing evens out. The cold still presses in, but the body adapts moment by moment. You drift towards sleep, waking briefly when someone shifts or sighs. Scholars still discuss how often sickness turned fatal in these conditions. Some sources emphasize high mortality. Others caution that dramatic cases were more likely to be recorded than recoveries. Most people endured and moved on their illnesses, fading quietly. You wake near dawn with a dry throat and a mild headache. Nothing serious. You stretch slowly, testing your body. Movement feels possible. That feels like success. You drink water before standing, letting warmth return gradually. The night has passed without escalation. The cold did not win this time. Illness did not take hold. You carry that quiet relief with you into the pale morning light. Tonight, when darkness falls again, you will listen once more. Not just for wind and fire, but for the subtle signs of bodies under strain. Survival here includes attention, patience, and the understanding that cold nights reveal weaknesses best met together. By now, you have learned that survival in the cold does not always come from big decisions. It often comes from small, almost invisible adjustments. The kind that would seem trivial anywhere else. Here they become the difference between enduring the night and fighting it. You watch someone carefully tuck loose fabric along the bottom edge of a shelter, pressing it down with stones. Another wedges a flat piece of wood against a gap where wind sneaks through. These actions take minutes, sometimes seconds, but the effect lasts all night. Drafts stop cutting across ankles. Heat lingers longer near the ground. It is generally acknowledged by historians of frontier life that miners became remarkably inventive with insulation, despite having little formal knowledge of heat retention. They worked through observation rather than theory, noticing which changes reduced shivering and which did not. Success spread quickly through imitation. You add pine boughs beneath your sleeping space again, thicker than before. Their needles release a faint, clean scent when crushed. The layer lifts you just enough that the ground feels less aggressive. You can tell immediately when you lie down. The cold still presses upward, but it arrives slower, dulled. Someone nearby stuffs spare clothing into the sleeves of a coat and uses it as a makeshift draft blocker along the shelter wall. It looks odd, but it works. The air stops moving, stillness returns. A lesser-known anecdote from a camp in the Cascades describes miners lining their shelters with flattened tin cans, hoping the metal would reflect heat inward. Results were mixed, but the attempt itself shows how people experimented, constantly testing ideas night after night. You notice how moisture becomes the next problem. Insulation traps warmth, but it also traps breath and sweat. Condensation forms quickly. Blankets grow damp at the edges. You rotate them carefully, exposing wet areas to slightly warmer air near the fire before returning them to place. There is continued scholarly discussion about how much moisture management affected survival rates. Some argue damp bedding was as dangerous as exposure. Others believe miners adapted fast enough to prevent serious harm. Tonight, you treat moisture with respect, knowing it can undo all your careful layering. You place your boots upside down near the fire, not too close, just close enough to drive off stiffness. Someone shows you how to stuff them with dry grass to absorb moisture overnight. It feels like a small trick, but warm boots in the morning matter more than you would have guessed. A quirky detail recorded in a later memoir mentions miners hanging socks from tent poles, like flags rotating them through the warmest air available. It looked chaotic, but it kept feet functional. Order mattered less than effectiveness. You lie down and feel the shelter holding heat better than it did a week ago. Not because materials have improved dramatically, but because gaps have been identified and closed. Knowledge accumulates quietly. Researchers still debate whether these improvised techniques emerged independently in each camp or spread through informal networks. Stories travelled with people. So did habits. What worked in one place often appeared elsewhere weeks later. During the night, you wake briefly and notice the difference. The cold feels more distant, present but restrained. You adjust one small thing, pulling a blanket, edge tighter then settle again. There is no urgency, just maintenance. Morning comes with less stiffness than before. Your fingers still move easily. Your breath feels clearer. These small improvements add up. They mean more energy for the day, more resilience for the next night. You step outside and glance back at the shelter. From the outside, it looks unchanged. Inside, it has been quietly engineered against the cold. Tonight, you will repeat these small rituals. Adjust, block, layer, dry. None of it dramatic. All of it essential. In the mountain camps, survival often depends on noticing what others overlook and caring about details no one would bother with anywhere else. As night settles again, you begin to notice patterns that once stayed invisible. Who tends the fire? Who arranges bedding? Who notices drafts first? These patterns are not random. They follow expectations carried from elsewhere, reshaped by the cold, but never fully erased. Warmth here is not just physical, it is organized. A widely recognized reality of many mining camps is that labor roles did not disappear after sunset. They shifted. Daytime work was loud and public. Nighttime work was quieter, often unseen but just as necessary. Bedding was shaken out, layers were arranged, damp clothing was moved closer to heat. These tasks mattered, even if they were rarely mentioned. You see it now as someone moves methodically through the shelter before lying down, checking corners, adjusting blankets, pressing fabric into gaps. The work looks familiar, practiced. It resembles domestic routines carried into a harsh new setting. Cold does not erase habit, it redirects it. There is ongoing discussion among social historians about how gender expectations played out in these environments. Some argue camps were rigidly masculine spaces with little room for domestic labour. Others point to evidence that women present in camps often shaped nighttime survival practices significantly. Both views appear incomplete when held alone. You recall that not all camps were exclusively male. Some included women running boarding houses, cooking meals, washing clothes. In these spaces, nighttime warmth was managed differently. Fires were banked more carefully. Bedding was more consistent. Small efficiencies accumulated. A curious account from a Colorado camp describes a woman insisting on airing blankets every afternoon, even when others saw it as wasted effort. The result was drier bedding at night and fewer complaints of chills. Practical knowledge trumped skepticism. Even in male only shelters, similar practices emerged over time. Someone took responsibility for bedding, someone else handled fire timing. Roles formed naturally, not assigned, but accepted. Cold rewarded organization. Scholars still debate whether these nighttime routines represented resistance to frontier hardship or acceptance of it. Some interpret them as attempts to recreate familiar domestic order. Others see them as pure survival adaptation. Lying here wrapped and listening, the distinction feels thin. Both impulses coexist. You notice how warmth flows differently depending on who is present. Someone smaller generates less heat, but moves less, creating fewer drafts. Someone larger radiates warmth, but shifts more often. Sleeping arrangements adjust accordingly. Bodies become variables in an unspoken equation. A lesser-known detail from camp letters mentions disagreements over who should sleep nearest the fire. These disputes were rarely about hierarchy alone. They reflected assumptions about strength, endurance, and fairness. Cold forced these values into negotiation. You lie still, observing without judgment. The shelter holds its heat reasonably well tonight. Blankets are placed efficiently. The fire is steady. This did not happen by chance. It came from repetition and quiet leadership. As the night deepens, you drift towards sleep more easily. The work has been done. Warmth is organized. You feel supported by systems that did not exist a week ago. Morning will scatter everyone again into individual effort. But tonight, warmth has been managed collectively, shaped by habit, expectation, and necessity. In these camps, survival is rarely solitary, even when it feels lonely. Someone has always adjusted something before you lay down. Someone will do so again tomorrow. The cold teaches cooperation without needing words. As night falls again, you become more aware of what is missing as much as what is present. Beyond the ring of firelight and the rough geometry of shelters, there is knowledge you did not bring with you. Ways of reading weather, ways of arranging space, ways of sleeping that belong to this landscape long before gold ever did. You feel their absence in every draft that surprises you. It is well established in regional histories that indigenous communities had lived and travelled through these mountain environments for generations before mining camps appeared. They understood cold not as an enemy to be fought, but as a condition to be worked with. Their shelters, clothing, and routines reflected long familiarity rather than hurried adaptation. You catch glimpses of this knowledge indirectly. Someone mentioned seeing snow piled deliberately against a structure, not as neglect but as insulation. Someone else recalls hearing that certain plant fibers trapped warmth better than others. These ideas circulate unevenly, half remembered, sometimes misunderstood. There has been extended scholarly discussion about how often miners actually adopted indigenous cold weather practices. Some researchers argue that cultural barriers and arrogance limited learning. Others point to evidence of quiet borrowing stripped of its origin and folded into camp routines. The truth appears uneven, shaped by proximity and necessity. You notice it when someone suggests banking snow along the windward side of a shelter, something you would have avoided instinctively weeks ago. Tonight it works. The interior grows calmer. Drafts soften. You do not question it. Results speak clearly here. A lesser-known detail from oral histories describes miners copying the practice of sleeping with feet oriented away from prevailing winds, something indigenous travellers understood instinctively. The adjustment seems small, but it reduces heat loss through extremities noticeably. You think about clothing again. Fur, hide, layering that follows movement rather than fashion. Some of what you wear now resembles garments you once dismissed as crude. Experience has revised your judgment. Researchers still debate the extent to which indigenous guides directly influenced camp survival versus knowledge spreading indirectly through observation. Written records are sparse. What remains is evidence in practice rather than attribution. You lie down feeling the shelter respond differently tonight. Snowbanks block wind. Blankets are layered with more intention. The cold still presses in, but it no longer surprises you as often. There is a quiet humility in this realization. You are not inventing survival here. You are rediscovering fragments of it filtered through urgency and adaptation. As sleep approaches, you listen to the wind slide over the shelter rather than through it. The difference is subtle but meaningful. The night feels steadier, less aggressive. Morning will erase some of this awareness as routine returns, but the knowledge remains embedded in habit now. Tonight you sleep a little warmer, carrying lessons learned long before you arrived. The night feels more crowded than usual, and not just with people. You hear soft movements beyond the shelter that do not belong to the wind. a hoof scraping frozen dirt, a slow breath that releases a cloud of steam. Animals are closer tonight, drawn by the same things you are: shelter, residual warmth, the promise of morning feed. In many mining camps, animals were not kept far from sleeping areas. Horses, mules, dogs, even livestock shared the edges of camp life, especially at night. This is a firmly grounded historical observation drawn from camp layouts and contemporary descriptions. Animals were valuable. Keeping them close reduced theft, prevented wandering, and offered an unexpected benefit: heat. You notice it immediately when you step outside briefly. The air feels slightly warmer near the animals, thick with breath and scent. Manure freezes, then insulates. Bodies radiate warmth steadily without needing fuel. You do not linger, but you register the effect. Dogs curl near entrances or under raised platforms. They know where heat collects. Some miners allow them inside shelters during the coldest nights. Others resist at first, then relent. The trade is simple: space and smell in exchange for warmth and quiet companionship. A curious note from a camp diary describes men sleeping with their backs against a horse enclosure wall, using the animal's body heat to soften the night cold. It was not comfortable, but it worked well enough to repeat. Horses tolerated it, standing patient and still. There remains disagreement among historians about how intentionally animals were used for warmth versus convenience. Some argue any benefit was incidental. Others suggest people quickly recognized and exploited the effect. Watching how naturally bodies cluster tonight, intention seems almost beside the point. Animals also change the sound of the night: snorts, shifts, hooves stamping occasionally to keep circulation moving. These sounds become part of the camp's rhythm, as familiar as fire crackle. You learn which noises mean restlessness and which mean calm. You hear a dog scratch briefly, then settle again. The sound reassures you. Animals sense changes in weather before people do. Their calm suggests no storm is coming. That knowledge eases you into rest more smoothly than any forecast could. There is another side to this closeness. Animals bring moisture. Breath condenses. Snow melts unevenly. You become more vigilant about dampness, moving bedding slightly farther from entrances, adjusting layers to account for it. Scholars still debate whether the presence of animals increased health risks in camps. Some evidence points to sanitation concerns. Other accounts emphasize emotional comfort and security. The truth likely varies by camp and circumstance. You lie down aware of the quiet presence nearby. Not human, but not separate either. Warmth flows differently when many bodies share the same space, even loosely. During the night, you wake briefly when an animal shifts. The sound is deep and solid, not sharp. You listen, recognize it, and settle again. Familiarity replaces alarm. Morning brings the smell of animals more clearly as the air warms slightly. Frost lifts, breath clouds thin. You stretch and feel the difference. The night felt marginally less severe. Tonight, animals will gather again. You will accept their presence without thinking too much about it. In the mountain camps, survival often means sharing space with anything that generates warmth and endures the cold beside you. When the snow stays, you begin to notice something counterintuitive. The cold does not always feel worse. In some ways, it feels steadier, less biting, less chaotic. The ground outside is white and quiet, and the wind that once sliced through camp now seems muted, slowed by the weight of it all. Snow transforms the night in ways few expect at first. A widely acknowledged observation in mountain history is that deep snow can act as insulation, sealing cracks, absorbing sound, and reducing wind exposure. What looked like a threat at first becomes, in certain conditions, a reluctant ally. You feel it immediately when you step inside the shelter. The drafts that once found their way through every seam have softened. Snow has banked itself against the lower walls, plugging gaps that fabric and wood never quite managed. The air inside feels calmer, heavier, almost padded. Sound changes too. Voices do not carry as far. Footsteps vanish into softness. The camp feels smaller, more enclosed, as if the world beyond has been wrapped and set aside for the night. This quiet brings its own kind of comfort. You remember how loud the wind once sounded before the snow arrived? How it whistled through spaces you could not fully block. Now, even when gusts pick up, they seem distant. Snow absorbs their edge, turning sharp movement into something duller. There has been long-standing discussion among environmental historians about whether early miners recognized snow's insulating properties quickly or learned only through experience. Some argue the benefit was obvious to anyone who endured a buried shelter. Others suggest fear dominated perception at first. Tonight, you do not think about theory, you feel the effect directly. You lie down and notice the temperature feels more even. Still cold, but less erratic. Extremes matter less when heat loss slows. Blankets hold warmth longer, breath fogs less dramatically. Small signs, but unmistakable. A lesser-known detail from a mining camp account in the Rockies describes men deliberately shoveling snow against the outside of their shelters after storms shaping it carefully to block windward sides. This practice, once learned, spread quickly. Snow became a building material rather than just an obstacle. Of course, snow is never entirely kind. Moisture remains a constant concern. Meltwater seeps where it can. Condensation increases inside. You stay alert to dampness, rotating bedding, keeping clothing as dry as possible. Insulation only helps if it stays dry. You also learn that snow hides danger. Paths disappear. Familiar routes blur. At night, stepping outside without care can mean sinking into drifts or slipping on ice beneath a thin crust. You move more slowly, memorizing new landmarks formed by accumulation. Researchers still debate whether snow reduced or increased overall risk in mountain camps. Some evidence suggests fewer wind-related exposures, but more accidents and supply shortages. The balance shifted depending on preparation and duration. Tonight, you are grateful for the quiet it brings. The shelter feels held rather than battered. The cold presses in evenly without sudden sharpness. Your body responds by relaxing just a little more. You notice how light behaves differently now. Firelight reflects faintly off snow through the shelter entrance, creating a softer glow. Moonlight outside turns the landscape pale and uniform, erasing contrast. Darkness feels less absolute. You drift towards sleep with fewer interruptions. The night still wakes you once or twice, but the reasons are subtler. A shift in temperature, a sound from inside rather than outside. The storm has already passed. What remains is stillness. Morning arrives with a muffled quality. Sounds return slowly. Voices seem closer. The camp emerges from white quietly like something uncovered rather than reborn. You step outside and see how snow has reshaped everything. Shelters look half buried. Fire pits sit in shallow bowls. Footpaths are suggestions rather than routes. And yet the camp endured. Tonight, if the snow remains, you will not fear it the way you once did. You will respect it, manage it, and use what it offers. In the mountains, survival often comes from understanding that the same force that threatens can also protect, depending on how you meet it. As sleep returns in longer stretches, you begin to notice how dreams change in the cold. They do not arrive suddenly or vividly. They drift in slowly weighted, shaped by the position of your body and the temperature around it. Sensations carry through. Pressure from blankets becomes landscape. The sound of wind becomes movement. Cold edits imagination without asking permission. Many first-hand accounts from mining camps describe dreams that felt closer to waking life than fantasy. This is a commonly noted feature in journals and letters. Miners wrote of dreaming about routine tasks, familiar trails, half-finished work, rather than dramatic visions. The body never fully relaxed, and the mind followed suit. You drift and surface repeatedly. Each time you check warmth instinctively. Are your feet still covered? Has the blanket slipped? Is the air moving differently? These checks happen without anxiety now. They are part of the night rhythm, as natural as breathing. When dreams do form, they are quiet. You might see a warm room, but without colour, or hear a voice without words. Often, the dream dissolves the moment you shift. Cold keeps the boundary between sleep and waking thin. There is active discussion among sleep researchers about how environmental stress shapes dreaming. Some suggest that cold suppresses deeper dream stages. Others argue it alters content rather than depth. In the camps, no one names it. They simply accept that sleep feels different here. A curious note from a minor letter mentions dreaming of fire more often than gold during winter months. Flames appeared as steady presences rather than threats. Comfort replaced ambition in the subconscious when nights grew harsh. You wake briefly again and notice how the shelter sounds. Breathing overlaps. Someone turns over slowly. The fire outside settles into a deeper glow. These sounds slip into the edges of your next dream, rather than waking you fully. Cold also seems to stretch time inside dreams. Moments linger, movement slows. You walk farther without arriving anywhere. This mirrors the physical world where effort increases and progress shrinks. The mind reflects the body's experience faithfully. Scholars still debate whether prolonged cold exposure affected memory formation and dream recall. Some evidence suggests fragmented sleep led to hazier recollections. Others argue vivid memories survived precisely because of discomfort. Your own recollection feels selective, only impressions remain. You notice that dreams end more easily than they begin. A small shift, a noise, a draft, and they are gone. You lie awake briefly, then slide back towards sleep again without resistance. Morning approaches quietly. The dreams thin out first. Awareness expands. The cold feels more distant now, no longer pressing urgently. You stretch slightly beneath blankets, careful not to lose warmth too quickly. You rise, knowing that the night has done its work, not just on your body but on your inner world. Cold has shaped your sleep, your dreams, your sense of time. You carry that with you into daylight, often without noticing. Tonight, when sleep comes again, it will follow the same gentle pattern, drifting, pausing, returning. In the mountain camps, even dreams learn to conserve energy. The fire feels different tonight, not weaker, not stronger, but more dangerous. You sense it in the way sparks lift higher than usual, in the way shadows jump faster along the shelter walls. Tight spaces and open flame have never been comfortable companions, and as camps grew denser, the risk followed quietly behind. It is a well-documented reality that fires cause significant damage in mining camps, especially during cold seasons, when flames were kept closer to shelters. Canvas burned fast, fresh timber caught easily. One careless movement could turn warmth into disaster in seconds. Everyone knew this, even if no one liked to think about it. You sit farther back than usual, watching how others manage the space. Someone nudges a burning stick inward with the toe of a boot. Another keeps a bucket of snow or dirt within reach, not formally assigned, just understood. Fire demands attention here. Comfort without vigilance invites loss. You remember hearing stories of entire camps lost overnight, not to storms or cold, but to flame. Fires spread quickly when wind cooperated. In some cases, people escaped with nothing but what they wore. The irony was bitter. Warmth destroyed what cold could not. There is disagreement among historians about how common large-scale fire disasters truly were. Some argue that dramatic accounts overshadow the many nights when fires burned safely. Others point to insurance records and newspaper reports that suggest fires were frequent enough to shape camp design. Either way, the fear remains present. You feel it when someone stands too quickly and brushes past the fire. A spark lands on fabric and dies instantly, but the moment lingers. No one comments. Eyes track the ember until it disappears. Then attention returns to quiet routines. A lesser-known anecdote from a California camp describes miners hanging damp blankets near fire pits as a precaution, ready to smother flames if needed. The practice slowed fire spread and bought time in emergencies. It was a simple measure learned through hard experience. You notice how fires are built lower now, closer to the ground, surrounded by stones or shallow pits. This was not always the case. Early camps favoured tall flames. Over time, people learned that coals offered steadier heat with less risk. Adaptation followed consequence. Inside, shelter's fire is treated with even more caution. Some refuse it entirely, choosing cold over catastrophe. Others risk small controlled flames, venting smoke, through gaps or chimneys made from improvised materials. Each choice carries its own dangers. Scholars continue to discuss whether fear of fire influenced sleeping arrangements. Some evidence suggests people slept closer together, partly to reduce the number of flames needed. Fewer fires meant less risk, even if it increased crowding. Safety reshaped space quietly. You lie down with the fire still active outside, aware that you will wake if its sound changes too sharply. A sudden roar, a collapse of embers, these signals matter. They are not just about warmth, they are about safety. During the night, you wake briefly when a spark pops louder than expected. Someone adjusts the fire immediately. The response is calm, practiced. Fear has been replaced by routine awareness. That does not make it less serious. It makes it manageable. Morning reveals scorch marks near the pit, blackened stones, singed fabric edges. Evidence of closeness. You are reminded again that survival here balances on narrow margins. Cold and fire both demand respect. Tonight, when darkness returns, you will watch the flames again with the same measured attention. Warmth is necessary, so is restraint. In the mountain camps, the coldest nights are survived, not just by generating heat, but by controlling it. By now, the camp no longer feels like a temporary accident. It feels adjusted, not comfortable, not settled in a permanent sense, but shaped by repetition. The sharp edges have been noticed, filed down, worked around. What once felt improvised now feels deliberate. You see it most clearly at night, when fewer mistakes are made. Early in the gold rush, many camps changed rapidly, or vanished just as fast. That much is firmly established in historical accounts. But the camps that survived longer winters show evidence of gradual refinement. Shelters improved, fire pits shifted, sleeping arrangements stabilized, adaptation became cumulative rather than reactive. You recognize this change in yourself as well. You move through evening routines without conscious thought. Wood is stacked automatically. Clothing is dried before you need it. Bedding is arranged the same way each night because that way works. Cold still exists, but it no longer surprises you as often. You notice how newcomers stand out now. They rush, they underestimate nightfall. They forget how fast warmth drains away once the sun disappears. You see yourself in them and feel a quiet recognition rather than judgment. Experience here is earned through discomfort, not instruction. There has been extended debate among historians about whether mining camps truly became safer over time or simply better at enduring hardship. Some argue that improved survival masked ongoing danger. Others suggest that collective learning genuinely reduced risk. Watching the camp settle into night, the answer seems layered. Danger remains, but ignorance fades. A lesser-known detail from later season camps is the appearance of semi-permanent sleeping platforms built from scrap wood. Raising bodies off the ground reduced heat loss significantly. These platforms were crude but effective, and once built they rarely disappeared. Knowledge solidified into structure. You lie down and feel the difference. The cold no longer feels like an active opponent. It feels like a condition you have planned for. Blankets hold heat longer, drafts are fewer, fire timing is predictable, sleep stretches a little deeper. This does not mean nights are easy. It means they are survivable with less effort. Energy once spent reacting can now be conserved. That conservation matters more than comfort. Scholars still argue whether this phase marked the beginning of true settlement or merely a pause before abandonment. Many camps eventually emptied when gold ran thin, but for a time adaptation gave the illusion of permanence. You wake briefly during the night and realize you are not immediately checking for cold. Instead you listen. Everything sounds normal. That realization lets you drift back to sleep without adjusting anything. This is progress measured in seconds of rest. Morning arrives with fewer complaints. Bodies stretch more easily. Movements feel smoother. Small improvements, but noticeable. You carry that ease into the day, work a little longer, think a little clearer. Tonight will bring cold again. It always does. But you trust your routines now. They have been tested, they have held. The camp breathes through the night like something alive shaped by trial, error, and repetition. And you are part of that rhythm now. no longer just enduring the cold, but working with it one night at a time. As another night approaches, you feel the tension between comfort and desire more clearly than ever. The camp has learned how to survive the cold, but survival alone was never the reason anyone came here. Gold still glimmers in conversations, in plans whispered near the fire, in the way people push themselves longer into exhaustion than they should. Winter has arrived, and yet many remain. It is a well-attested historical reality that countless miners stayed in mountain camps far later into the season than was sensible, driven by what was often called gold fever. Even as temperatures dropped and travel routes closed, people convinced themselves that one more day, one more dig might change everything. The cold did not discourage ambition, it tested it. You feel this conflict in your own body. Nights drain energy faster now, even with all the adjustments you have learned. Mornings arrive, colder, darker, and more reluctant. Still, when daylight breaks, tools are lifted, claims are worked, and plans are made. The promise of reward keeps people enduring nights that would otherwise send them back down the mountain. There has long been debate among historians about whether miners truly believed winter success was possible, or whether optimism simply overpowered judgment. Some argue that occasional rich strikes justified the risk. Others suggest that social pressure and sunk cost trapped people into staying longer than reason allowed. Watching faces near the fire, you see both hope and stubbornness flicker together. You notice how conversations shift at night. Less talk of leaving, more talk of perseverance. Stories circulate about someone who struck gold late in the season, reinforcing the idea that endurance itself might be rewarded. These stories are rarely verified, but they do not need to be. Belief carries its own heat. A curious detail from a winter camp account describes miners carving notches into shelter walls to count days survived rather than gold found. The mark served as quiet proof of endurance. Survival became an achievement in its own right, even if no one said it aloud. You lie down, knowing tomorrow will demand strength you are not sure you fully have. Cold sleep restores less than warm sleep. Fatigue accumulates invisibly, still you accept the bargain again. The mountain has not forced you to stay. Desire has. Scholars continue to debate whether gold fever should be understood as economic rationality or psychological fixation. Some miners calculated risks carefully, others chased rumours blindly. In the cold camps, these distinctions blur. Everyone feels the pull. During the night you wake and think briefly of leaving, of descending toward warmer valleys, of beds that do not require negotiation. The thought brings comfort, but also a sense of loss. Leaving means surrendering possibility. You pull the blankets tighter and let the thought pass. Morning will come, and with it another chance to dig, to hope, to justify the night you just endured. In the mountain camps, winter does not end gold fever. It distills it. Those who remain are not necessarily stronger. They are simply more willing to endure the coldest nights in exchange for what might lie buried beneath frozen ground. Some nights, despite everything you have learned, warmth simply does not hold. You sense it early the way the cold sharpens, instead of softening the way your body refuses to settle. The fire burns lower than expected, the wind shifts just enough to find a weakness. Blankets feel thinner, as if the night itself has grown heavier. Historical records acknowledge that even well-adapted camps experienced nights when conditions overwhelmed preparation. Sudden temperature drops, unexpected moisture, or simple exhaustion could unravel routines that usually worked. Survival here was never guaranteed. It was negotiated night by night. You feel it in your hands first. Fingers curl inward involuntarily. Toes lose sensation despite layers. You move closer to others, but even shared heat feels insufficient. This is the edge where endurance becomes effort rather than habit. Someone wakes fully and feeds the fire using more wood than planned. The decision is not debated. Warmth now outweighs tomorrow's concern. Sparks lift and vanish. Heat surges briefly, then steadies. Relief arrives, but it feels fragile. There has been long-standing scholarly debate about how often nights like this turned fatal. Some historians argue deaths from exposure were relatively rare compared to accidents and disease. Others contend that cold claimed many quietly, especially among the weak or ill. The truth remains difficult to quantify because survival often blurred into disappearance. You adjust position repeatedly, trying to trap warmth that refuses to stay put. Each movement costs energy. Shivering begins small at first, then more pronounced. You slow your breathing, focusing on control, knowing panic wastes heat. A haunting anecdote from a winter camp describes a miner sitting upright all night, unable to sleep, afraid that letting go would mean losing the fight to stay warm. He survived, but remembered that night more vividly than any gold he ever found. You feel fear press in, not sudden or dramatic, but quiet and persistent. It asks whether this night might be the one that takes more than you can give. You answer by staying alert, by sharing space, by doing everything you have learned to do. Scholars still debate whether fear itself worsened cold exposure by increasing energy expenditure, or helped survival by keeping people awake. In moments like this, the line feels thin. Alertness keeps you moving. Movement costs warmth. Gradually, the worst of it passes. The fire holds. The wind eases. Your shivering slows. Exhaustion replaces fear. You drift into shallow sleep, aware that you did not win so much as endure. Morning arrives, pale and unforgiving. You wake stiff-sore and deeply tired, but alive. Around you, others rise slowly, exchanging glances that say enough. No one boasts, no one explains. The night speaks for itself. You carry that experience forward. It sharpens respect for the cold. It reminds you that routines reduce risk, but never erase it. Some nights, survival demands everything you have learned, and then a little more. Tonight may be easier, or it may not. In the mountain camps, certainty is a luxury no one expects. With time, you notice how the nights you endured begin to change shape in memory. What once felt endless now feels compressed. Details blur. Hard edges soften. Around the fire, stories begin to circulate that sound almost familiar, even if you know they are not entirely accurate. Memory here does not preserve, it edits. A commonly accepted observation in gold rush studies is that accounts written years later often exaggerate or simplify the hardships of camp life. Cold nights become colder, storms arrive faster, survival feels more dramatic in retrospect. This is not always intentional. Memory reshapes experience to make sense of endurance. You listen as someone describes a night that sounds suspiciously like the one you survived together. Weeks ago, only now the fire went out completely. The wind howled louder and frost crept across faces like something alive. No one interrupts. Corrections feel unnecessary. The feeling of the story matters more than precision. You recognize this impulse in yourself. When you think back to your first nights here, the cold seems sharper than it felt at the time, the fear more vivid, the exhaustion deeper. Distance has allowed the experience to condense into symbols rather than sensations. There is long-running discussion among historians about whether these embellished memories distort our understanding of frontier life or reveal something more truthful about emotional experience. Some argue exaggeration obscures reality. Others suggest it captures how hardship felt, not how it measured. Sitting here listening, you understand both positions. A quirky recollection, recorded in a later memoir, describes a miner insisting that ice formed inside his beard every night for an entire winter. Meteorological records suggest this was unlikely. Still, the image persisted, passed along as proof of resilience rather than fact. Stories serve a purpose now. They create distance between the present and the worst moments. They turn survival into narrative rather than ongoing effort. This transformation offers comfort. What has been survived can be spoken about safely. You lie down that night thinking about how memory will treat this place. Which nights will stand out? Which details will vanish? The smell of damp wool may fade. The precise sound of wind through canvas may disappear. But the sense of having endured will remain. Researchers still debate how much oral tradition from mining camps can be trusted as literal record. Some details align closely with physical evidence. others drift. Archaeology often tells a quieter story than memory does. Both matter in different ways. You notice that even recent nights already feel distant. The one where the fire burned too low, the one when snow sealed the shelter. They blend together. What remains is a general impression. Cold, effort, persistence. This reshaping of memory does not feel like loss. It feels like relief. The body remembers what to do. The mind releases what it no longer needs to carry. Morning arrives and you move through routines without thinking about the stories being formed around you. Memory will do its work later. For now, the night is over, and that is enough. In time, when someone asks what it was like, you may answer simply, cold, hard, manageable. The truth will sit somewhere between what you felt and what you remember. As the nights grow familiar, you start to notice traces left behind by those who came before. Not grand monuments or written records, but small, physical hints embedded in the ground, and shelter remains. A shallow fire pit dug just deep enough to block wind, stones arranged in a partial circle where a wall once stood. These details whisper about how people once endured the dark. Modern archaeological studies of former mining camps consistently show evidence of nighttime adaptation. Fire scars cluster near shelter entrances. Layers of ash suggest repeated careful burning rather than reckless flame. Sleeping platforms leave faint impressions in soil long after wood has rotted away. These patterns tell a story quieter than memoirs, but often more reliable. You imagine someone kneeling here years ago, arranging stones much like you do now. They faced the same cold, felt the same urgency. Their solutions linger in the landscape, even after names and faces disappear. Survival leaves marks even when memory fades. There is continuing academic discussion about how much can truly be inferred from these remains. Some researchers argue that interpretation risks projecting modern assumptions onto past behaviour. Others believe patterns are too consistent to ignore. Standing here, you sense intention in the arrangement. Cold shapes behaviour predictably. You notice how often fire pits are placed on the leeward side of former shelters. Wind direction mattered, so did slope. Even small elevation changes affected warmth retention. These choices repeat across sites separated by miles, suggesting shared understanding rather than coincidence. A curious archaeological note from a Sierra Nevada site describes clusters of flat stones, believed to have supported heated rocks moved into sleeping areas at night. The stones showed repeated thermal stress cracking from heat cycles. It is a silent record of warmth carried carefully from fire to body. You feel a strange connection to these traces. They reflect not ambition or success, but nightly survival. Gold rarely leaves such consistent marks. Warmth does. Scholars still debate whether archaeological evidence captures daily routine more accurately than written accounts. Diaries emphasize emotion and drama. Remains emphasize repetition. Both offer partial truths. Together they sketch a fuller picture. You lie down aware that your own routines would leave similar traces if the camp vanished tomorrow. The way you stack wood, the place you sit, the pattern of ash beneath the fire. These details feel temporary now, but they accumulate quietly. Morning erases some signs, footprints fill with frost, ash scatters, but not everything disappears. Some things settle deeper, becoming part of the ground itself. You step outside and look across the camp, imagining it empty one day. Shelters collapsed, fire pits filled in. Yet the arrangement would still speak to someone who knew how to read it. They would see where warmth mattered most. Tonight, when you tend the fire and arrange bedding, you are participating in a pattern older than this camp. Survival habits repeat across generations, even when names change. The cold nights you endure are not unique. They are part of a long sequence of nights, survived by ordinary people in extraordinary conditions. Archaeology remembers that, quietly, without exaggeration or nostalgia. As darkness approaches again, you feel grounded by that thought. You are not alone in this experience, even across time. Others have done this before, leaving just enough behind to prove it. The coldest hour arrives without drama. It always does, somewhere between night and morning, when the fire has settled into its deepest glow and even the animals are still. The camp reaches a quiet equilibrium. You wake briefly and realize that this moment more than any other defines survival here. It is broadly acknowledged in historical climate reconstructions that temperatures in mountain mining camps often reach their lowest point just before dawn. This was the hour miners feared most, not because it was violent, but because it was relentless. If warmth held here, it would hold until morning. You lie still listening. No wind, no sudden cracks, just the faint sound of breathing and the occasional soft pop from embers. The shelter feels balanced, neither gaining nor losing heat too quickly. This steadiness feels earned. You check your body without moving much, fingers still responsive, toes not numb, breath slow and even. These small confirmations matter. They tell you that the systems you built through habit and attention have worked. There has been continued scholarly discussion about whether miners consciously recognized this pre-dawn danger window or simply responded to it instinctively. Some letters describe deliberate vigilance. Others mention waking at the same hour without knowing why. You feel the truth of it in your body. Awareness rises naturally when risk peaks. A quiet detail recorded in one camp journal describes miners whispering to each other at this hour, not to talk but to confirm presence. A murmur, a name, a reply, proof that everyone was still there. It was not fear, it was reassurance. You remain awake just long enough to sense the shift. The cold stops intensifying. The air feels no warmer but less hostile. The night has reached its limits. You let yourself relax again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance tips. The cold loosens its grip. It does not retreat yet, but it stops advancing. This change is subtle but unmistakable to anyone who has endured it enough times. Scholars still debate whether this awareness sharpened over time or remained unconscious. The evidence is mixed. What matters is the result. People survived because they noticed, adjusted, and waited. You drift back into sleep knowing the worst has passed. When you wake again, it will be to a different quality of cold, one that belongs to morning, not night. The final moments arrive gently now. The fire breathes low and steady. Blankets hold their shape. The shelter feels quiet, almost protective. You breathe slowly, letting your body sink fully into the space it has learned to trust. Outside, the sky begins its slow shift, though you do not need to see it. You feel it. The air changes. The night loosens. What was tense becomes permissive. You think dimly of all the nights you have crossed to reach this one. The first shock. The adjustments. The shared warmth. The mistakes and small victories. None of it needs to be remembered clearly now. The body knows what to do. You allow your breathing to lengthen. Muscles soften. The cold remains, but it no longer demands your attention. It has been managed. It can wait. Somewhere nearby, someone stirs, sensing morning before light confirms it. A quiet movement, a sigh, life preparing to resume. You stay still a moment longer, suspended between night and day, wrapped in the calm that only arrives after endurance. This is the quiet reward, not comfort but relief, not warmth but safety. As sleep deepens one last time, the camp holds. The mountain remains, and you rest knowing that for tonight you survived. Sweet dreams.